We've come back to Benchmark Furniture to start another conversation about material, and very specifically around attitudes to American hardwood and what is perceived to be acceptable. We brought in some material of the next grade down. We're not using what the Americans originally designated as the furniture grade, which is No.1 Common. I would say that's the same for every workshop in the UK and for most workshops across Europe.
We've been experimenting with this timber for a couple of weeks. So we're working with 5 species. We've got maple, red oak, cherry, hickory and birch. We've been making panels up out of these different species. I consider myself very, very lucky as a maker to be in and around these materials every day. So we're seeing all of the beautiful characteristics and natural character of this wood. But we're often making judgments about what we think or what we're advised is or isn't acceptable in a finished product. And to me and a lot of the makers, we look at that and go, that's really beautiful, that's really exciting, that's a natural product. You open up a tree and you see the beautiful grain and natural characteristics of wood. To then start selecting that out and to be trying to create something that's very uniform and clean and perfect doesn't really make sense to us as makers.
So the first test we did was creating 2 different panels, one clean, no character, and one with character, embracing all the knots, splits, colour variation of the timber, and comparing the 2 to see what the kind of differences in yield and aesthetic and how it machines, and seeing what people prefer out of those 2 timbers. And embracing that character is something that kind of we want to push and go forward with in the future.
I think what's been the most surprising aspect of working with No.1 Common is kind of how much I've had to reprogram my initial process of working with timber. A lot of the time I kind of have to consider knots and splits and machine around them or orientate components differently. Whereas within this project we've been embracing those defects in the wood. So that's been really lovely. It's been a lot less time consuming and I feel better connected with the material as well.
More than ever, we need to think very carefully about how we specify, how we use, how we process that material to get the best out of it. The AHEC programme is tasked with making sure that we promote what the forest is growing to the market. We try and create that connection between what nature provides and what we then use as a material. It helps the sustainability of the forest to be actively taking out mature trees so the next generation of forest can grow. And I think an interesting follow-on from that is, do we then end up with a more interesting product?
I always think there's more we can do to celebrate the natural product. But I think we've got to make sure that we're seeing it and we're not selecting it out and making a judgment that that might not be appreciated or loved or wanted. And early stages on in projects that we're talking about what's available. No 2 trees look the same. So why do you expect 2 planks of wood to look the same? We've got an interesting thing happening with technology and with renderings that people are presenting visuals of schemes. A whole wall panels of 10 floors on office and it all looks exactly the same. That's not achievable. That's not real. So it's about trying to root that in the forest and in the material and having that conversation early enough. But we certainly see a real appetite to work with the materials and with the characteristics.
You then have a look and see what the imitation wood finishes and products are doing. It's quite extraordinary. They're using plastic or paper print, but quite often they'll go, oh, well, the best bit in that is that wild bit of grain or not. We'll take a really nice example and we'll reproduce that 20 times across the panel. They're imitating, quite often, the characteristics that we put in our off-cut bin, and we've got the real thing.
But actually, as soon as you start explaining that the lower grade timber has more character, has more natural characteristics, has more colour, more knots, more grain, more evidence of a natural product, I think it's in many ways a higher product. But in the UK, it's not something that our suppliers have on the shelves ready available that we can purchase and we can buy. So to be able to experiment with No.1 Common as a grade and to perhaps open the eyes of some suppliers and architects and clients that this material and this grade is available and isn't being used and there isn't a market, I think is really exciting.
What we're doing here is beginning something really important. You know, we're lighting a fire that we then want to try and spread that message. We're using what we're doing here to then be able to go and tell the wider joinery industry, this is what we've learned, could you consider a different approach? This is going to unfold, I think, over the coming months and years, and you know, we've made a really interesting start this week, so watch this space.